Every man in Caldera Flats knew that Clayton Haskins would sooner wrestle a longhorn to the ground with his bare hands than tip his hat to anyone. Yet the morning Etta Doyle stepped off the southbound stage with nothing but a carpetbag and a set of eyes the color of a summer storm. He pulled that battered brim clean off his head before he even knew his arm had moved. The year was 1878, and Caldera Flats sat in the wide crease of a Nevada valley like a penny dropped between two mountain ranges, close enough to the railroad spur that commerce breathed through it, far enough from civilization that a person could still fire a rifle at noon without startling anyone who mattered. The town had a water trough, a general store run by a man named Pruitt who kept his thumb on every scale he owned, a saloon called the Copper Bell, a church whose bell was cracked and rang flat on Sundays, and a land office where disputes were settled with paper when possible and with fists when paper failed. It also had, presiding over the eastern range like a king who had never been asked whether he wanted the crown, Clayton Haskins and his outfit, the Bar H Ranch. Clayton was 31 years old in the fall of that year, and he had lived every one of those years hard. He stood 2 inches over 6 feet, broad through the chest and narrow at the hip in the way that men who worked cattle from sunup to blackness tended to be. His hair was dark brown and perpetually pressed flat at the sides from the weight of his hat, which he wore the way other men wore their own skin, as if removing it were an act of self-exposure he had no patience for. He had a jaw that looked like it had been finished with a wood plane, and a scar along the left side of his chin from a wire fence incident in 1872 that he had never once discussed with anyone. He ran 1,100 head of cattle, kept 4 full-time ranch hands on wages, and owned water rights on Cutter Creek that every other rancher in the valley coveted with the kind of quiet, grinding jealousy that made men do unwise things after their second whiskey. Nobody in Caldera Flats called Clayton warm. They called him fair because he was, and they called him hard because he was that too, and they called him the roughest rancher in the valley because in 10 years of working this land, he had not once backed down from a confrontation, not once let a fence line get pushed, and not once spoken a word he did not mean. He had 2 friends, if you stretch the definition: his foreman Hector Vega, a lean and weathered man from Sonora who had ridden with Clayton since the early days, and his horse, a blue roan named Carbine who trusted Clayton more than any human being in the valley did. He did not think he needed anything else. He had been wrong before, but never about something that mattered as much as this. Etta Doyle was 24 years old and had come to Caldera Flats from a town called Mercy's Crossing in eastern Kansas, where she had spent the last 3 years teaching the children of farmers in a one-room schoolhouse that leaked when it rained and baked like a Dutch oven when it did not. She was not a tall woman, perhaps 5'4" in her boots, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up with a practical severity that did not quite succeed in making her look severe, because her face would not cooperate with severity. She had a wide mouth that curved easily toward a smile and eyes that, as noted, were a complicated gray-green that changed shade depending on the light and depending on her mood, going cooler when she was thinking hard and warmer when she was about to say something honest. She had come west because Caldera Flats had advertised for a schoolteacher in the territorial newspaper, and because Mercy's Crossing had become, in the quiet and unstated way of small towns, a place where she no longer fit the shape that everyone had decided she was supposed to fill. She had been engaged once briefly to a man named Gerald Pence who sold dry goods and had good intentions, and had ultimately chosen a woman who did not ask as many questions as Etta did. She had not cried much over Gerald, which had told her something about herself that she was still in the process of understanding. The stage from the rail junction at Hooper's Bend took 6 hours and arrived in Caldera Flats at 10:30 in the morning, which on an October day in 1878 meant the sun was already well up, and the air had that thin, dry clarity that the Nevada desert produced in autumn, sharp enough to see every ridge on the mountains 20 miles distant. Etta stepped down from the coach onto the packed dirt of Main Street and stood there for a moment with her carpetbag in one hand and her other hand shading her eyes, taking in the measure of the place she had agreed to make her home for at least one school year. She had been told, in the letters exchanged with the town's school board chairman, a man named Aldous Prewitt, who was indeed the same Prewitt who owned the general store, that she would be met at the stage and shown to her accommodations, a room behind the schoolhouse that had been recently whitewashed and furnished. Aldous Prewitt was not at the stage. What was at the stage was a small crowd of the naturally curious, 2 children chasing a dog, and Clayton Haskins, who had ridden into town that morning for no reason he would have been able to explain clearly to anyone, least of all himself, since he had no supplies to collect and no business at the land office and no appointment of any kind. He had simply saddled carbine and ridden in, which was a thing he rarely did without purpose, and he was standing at the rail in front of the copper bell, with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, trying to look like a man who had somewhere to be when the stage rolled in. He watched the passengers descend, a drummer with sample cases, an older man in a preacher's collar, and then Etta, who came down the coach step carefully with her carpetbag, and then stood in the street and looked at the town with an expression that was not disappointment and was not relief and was something more complicated than either, something that looked, to Clayton's eye, like a person measuring a challenge and deciding they were equal to it. He did not know why he took his hat off. He had not planned to. His hand moved of its own accord, and the hat came off his head, and he stood there in the October sunlight holding it against his thigh, feeling faintly ridiculous and not caring as much as he should have. Etta happened to look in his direction at precisely that moment, and she saw a very large man with dark flat-pressed hair standing in front of a saloon holding his hat and watching her with the focused intensity of a man who was not used to being surprised by anything and was clearly surprised now. She noted him the way she noted most things, completely, quickly, and with the kind of honest assessment she rarely bothered to hide. She nodded at him. He nodded back. Then Aldous Prewitt came bustling around the corner of his store with an apology on his lips and a nervous energy about him that immediately set Etta's instincts on edge, and the moment with Clayton broke apart like smoke. But she remembered the hat. She remembered it for reasons she could not immediately name. The schoolhouse was a single rectangular building with 4 windows and a wood stove that needed a new flue pipe, and the room behind it where Etta was to live was small and smelled of fresh whitewash and old wood, and the ghost of whoever had lived there before her. She spent her first afternoon arranging her small number of possessions and making lists of what the school needed, which was considerable. McGuffey readers, chalk, better maps. A globe would be wonderful but was probably not feasible. Prewitt had shown her around with the cheerful efficiency of a man who wanted her to feel settled before she noticed the problems, and she had been polite about it while noting every problem nonetheless. Her first week in Caldera Flats was one of orientation and introduction. She met the families who had children of school age, which was a surprisingly large number given the town's size, 22 children in all between the ages of 6 and 14, the offspring of ranchers and tradespeople, and one family of freed black homesteaders, named the Campbells, who had a farm on the western edge of the valley. When Etta learned that the Campbell children, 2 boys named Marcus and James, had not been attending the previous school sessions because the previous teacher had made their father feel unwelcome, she went directly to Nathaniel Campbell's homestead herself, stood on his porch, and told him clearly and without decoration that his sons were expected in her classroom on Monday, and that she would consider their absence a loss to her students' education. Nathaniel Campbell looked at her for a long moment, and then said that he supposed Monday would work fine. This was the first story about Etta Doyle that traveled through Caldera Flats, and it arrived in the ears of different people with different meanings attached to it. Aldous Prewitt heard it with a tightening around the eyes that he covered with a commercial smile. Several of the ranch wives heard it with a cautious approval. Clayton Haskins heard it from Hector Vega, who had heard it at the feed store, and he heard it with something he would not have called admiration at the time, though that is what it was. Their second encounter happened on a Friday, 8 days after her arrival. Clayton had come into town with Hector to file a boundary survey at the land office, a routine document relating to his water rights on Cutter Creek, which a neighboring rancher named Dolph Ingram had been quietly disputing for the better part of a year. The land office was next to the hardware store, which was 2 doors down from the schoolhouse. Clayton and Hector had finished their filing and were standing on the boardwalk when the schoolhouse door opened, and the children came pouring out for their midday recess, tumbling into the street with the released energy of the young, and behind them in the doorway stood Etta with a piece of chalk still in her hand and her hair coming loose from its pins on one side. She saw him immediately. He was not a man easily missed. "You were at the stage," she said from the doorway. It was not a question. "I was," he said. She stepped down from the schoolhouse step and crossed the small distance of boardwalk between them, and she extended her hand. "Etta Doyle, I am the new school teacher." He shook her hand. His hand was enormous and rough with work, and he shook hers the way he would shake a man's hand, firmly, without the cautious hesitation that some men used with women as if they were made of china. She appreciated that without saying so. "Clayton Haskins," he said, "Bar H Ranch. You own the water rights on Cutter Creek," she said. He looked at her with a slight shift in his expression, something between surprise and reassessment. "I do. How do you know that?" "Aldous Pruitt mentioned it during my orientation tour," she said. He mentioned it with the particular inflection that people use when they are not entirely happy about a thing. Hector, standing 2 steps behind Clayton, made a sound that might have been a cough and was definitely a suppressed laugh. Clayton did not look back at him. "Pruitt has opinions," Clayton said. "Most people do," Etta said. "Good morning, Mr. Haskins." She looked at Hector. "And you?" Hector removed his own hat with considerably more practiced ease than Clayton had shown at the stage and smiled with genuine warmth. "Hector Vega, miss. Foreman at Bar H. A pleasure," she said, and she looked back at Clayton one more time, a measured glance that took him in from boot to hat brim, and then she went back inside her schoolhouse. Clayton stood on the boardwalk looking at the closed door for a moment longer than was natural. Then he put his hat back on and walked toward Carbine without a word, and Hector followed him, and it was not until they were a mile out of town on the return trail that Hector spoke. "You took your hat off for her," Hector said. "I take my hat off for people," Clayton said. "You do not," Hector said, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had known Clayton Haskins for 9 years. "I have seen you leave your hat on during Sunday services. I have seen you eat dinner at the alderman's table with your hat on. I saw you get your shoulder stitched up by Doc Ferris with your hat on. You do not take your hat off for people." "Leave it," Clayton said. Hector left it, but he was smiling for the rest of the ride home. The weeks that followed moved in the particular rhythm of a ranching autumn, which was the hardest season of the working year, the final push before winter to get the cattle through the last of the grazing rotation, make repairs to fencing and outbuildings, lay in feed stores, and account for every head on the range. Clayton drove himself and his hands without apology, because the work demanded it, and because the work had always been the thing that made the most sense to him, the thing that returned what you put into it in direct and honest measure. But he found reasons to be in town more than he had been. He would not have admitted this under most circumstances, but it was true. He came in for supplies that could have waited. He came in to check on the land office matter with Ingram's dispute, which was real enough but did not require his personal attention as often as he gave it. He came in on 2 occasions for no stated reason at all, and on both of those occasions he passed the schoolhouse at the hour when children were coming out and Etta Doyle was standing in the doorway or on the step, and they spoke briefly, and each time he took off his hat. The townspeople noticed. In a town the size of Caldera Flats, everything was noticed eventually, but some things were noticed with particular interest, and Clayton Haskins removing his hat in conversation with the schoolteacher was interesting enough to fuel the copper bell for several evenings. Etta noticed it too. She was not a woman who missed details. One Thursday afternoon in November, 3 weeks into the school term, she was walking back from the general store with a wrapped package of chalk and 2 new McGuffey readers that she had ordered through Pruitt's supply catalog and paid for out of her own wages, because the school's operating fund was, as she had suspected, inadequate to its actual needs. She was on the boardwalk in front of the copper bell when a raised voice from inside pulled her attention sideways. Through the saloon's half-open door, she could hear Dolph Ingram, who she had by this point identified as a man whose confidence in his own correctness was impervious to evidence, telling someone that the water rights document filed at the land office was fraudulent, and that he intended to prove it with or without the court's assistance. She did not know enough about the specifics to have a firm opinion, but she knew the tone of a man working himself toward something reckless, and it sat uneasily with her as she continued down the boardwalk. She mentioned it to Hector Vega the next time she saw him, which was at the feed store the following Saturday, where he was loading a wagon with grain sacks. She told him what she had heard and described Ingram's tone as precisely as she could. Hector set down the grain sack he was holding and looked at her with a seriousness that told her she had been right to mention it. "When was this?" he asked. "Thursday afternoon," she said. "Around 3 o'clock. "I will tell Clayton," Hector said. "Thank you, Miss Doyle." "Does this happen often?" she asked. Ingram stirring up trouble. Hector considered whether to answer fully and decided that she had earned the full answer. "Ingram has been trying to push Clayton's fence line for 4 years, he said. "He wants the creek access. He has tried the legal route twice and lost both times because the rights are legitimate and the documentation is solid. Now he is trying the social route, telling stories to people in town about how the original survey was crooked. And there are people who listen because Clayton is not the kind of man who makes himself easy to defend. Because he does not explain himself," Etta said. Hector looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between appreciation and surprise. "That is exactly it. Some people mistake silence for guilt," she said. "Yes," Hector said, "some people do." She thought about this on the walk home, and about Clayton Haskins, and about the way he had taken his hat off at the stage when no one in this valley apparently expected him to be capable of such a gesture. And she thought about what it meant when a person was one thing in their private self and another thing in the story that the world had written about them without their consent. She had experience with that particular gap. Clayton came to the school the following Monday. Not during school hours, but in the early evening, after the children had gone, and the light was going gold and flat across the valley floor. He knocked on the schoolhouse door, and Etta opened it with her hair half down from its daytime arrangement, having loosened it now that the school day was done, and she was holding a book, and she looked at him with an expression of pleasant surprise. "Mr. Haskins," she said. He took off his hat. "Miss Doyle, I am sorry to come without notice. Hector told me what you heard at the copper bell. I wanted to thank you." "You did not need to ride in for that," she said. "It was the right thing to do." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to anyway." There was a pause in which the evening air moved between them, dry and cool and carrying the smell of sage from the open range. "Would you like to come in?" she asked. "I have coffee on the stove." He looked at the doorway, then at her, and something in his expression shifted from its usual guarded set into something more careful and more open at the same time. "I would," he said, "if it is not an imposition." "It is not," she said. He ducked through the doorway, which required a slight duck at his height, and stood in the schoolroom looking at what she had done with it. She had arranged the children's desks in a careful semicircle rather than the traditional rows, and the walls had maps pinned to them, one of the United States, one of the Western Territories, and one that surprised him, a large hand-drawn map of the local valley that she had clearly made herself, with topographic features sketched in with careful detail. "You drew this?" he asked, standing in front of the valley map. "I walked the main roads and the creek line in the evenings my first 2 weeks," she said, bringing 2 tin cups of coffee from the back room. "The children need to understand the place they live in. Geography is not abstract when you live inside it." He took the coffee and looked at the map more closely. She had marked Cutter Creek accurately. She had marked the ranch boundaries, including his. "You have the bar H right," he said. "I used the survey documents at the land office," she said. "Mr. Denny, the land clerk, was very helpful." He turned from the map and looked at her, and she met his look without the slight flinching uncertainty that he had come to expect from people in this valley, who tended to find his direct attention a little too much of something and looked away or softened their expressions as if in apology. She simply looked back at him, holding her coffee with both hands, and waited. "Ingram is not going to stop," he said. "I know," she said. "What will you do?" "What I have always done," he said. "Hold my ground. The rights are clean. The survey is legitimate. If he pushes it to a proper court, the record will show it." "And if he does not push it to a court?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I will handle it some other way." "I hope the other way does not involve anything that brings trouble back on you," she said, and her voice was level, but there was something in it that was not quite neutrality, something that had warmth and concern at its edges. He looked at her carefully. "Why would that concern you?" he asked, not unkindly, genuinely curious. She thought about the honest answer, which was, "Because I have been in this valley for 3 weeks, and I have already formed the opinion that you are a better man than the story this town tells about you. And I find that I do not want to see a better man damaged by someone else's dishonesty." But she did not say that, not yet, because they were not there yet, and she said instead, "Because I have 22 students whose education depends on this valley remaining orderly, and the valley is not orderly when its largest rancher is in a public dispute." He almost smiled. She could see it at the corner of his mouth, controlled and barely there. "That is a practical reason," he said. "I'm a practical person," she said. He stayed for 1 cup of coffee and then took his leave with a courtesy that she found herself thinking about after he had gone, standing at the window of the back room, watching the last of the sunset fade over the western mountains. He had taken his hat off when he came in and held it throughout the visit, which seemed to her to say something she was not yet sure how to read. He was the roughest rancher in the valley and the only one who took off his hat when she spoke. She had already learned this from the small social map she was building in her head. She had met Ed Corliss, who ran cattle on the western range, and had spoken through her to Hector during the one conversation they had had, as if she were a relay post rather than a person. She had met Frank Alderman, who owned a respectable spread north of town, and had been perfectly pleasant while managing to address every substantive remark to the man standing nearest to her. She had met Dolph Ingram himself, briefly, outside the general store, and he had spoken to her the way certain men spoke to teachers, with the tolerant condescension reserved for someone performing a necessary but minor civic function. Clayton Haskins had never once done any of those things. He looked at her when he talked to her. He listened when she talked. He took off his hat. It was, in the calculus of 1878 in a Nevada valley, more unusual than it had any right to be. The trouble with Ingram moved faster than Clayton had anticipated. In late November, Ingram filed a new complaint with the Territorial Land Office in Carson City, not the local land office, a complaint that alleged irregularities in the original 1869 survey that had established Clayton's water rights. It was a sophisticated move, because the original surveyor had died in 1874 and could not testify, and because the complaint was filed through a Carson City attorney who knew how to dress a thin case in enough procedural clothing to make it walk around for a while. Word came back to Caldera Flats via the stage and via the telegraph at the general store, and by the time Clayton knew about it, Pruitt had already told half the town. Clayton sat in the Bar H's main room that evening with Hector and read the summary of the complaint that the local land clerk had copied out for him, and he was quiet for a long time. The room around him was the spare, functional room of a man who lived alone and did not think much about what rooms were supposed to look like. A table, 4 chairs, a stove, a rifle on the wall, a shelf of account ledgers and 2 books, one of which was a Bible he had inherited from his mother, and the other of which was a surveying manual he had bought in 1867 when he first started building the ranch. "He went to Carson City because he knows he cannot win it locally," Hector said. "He wants to cost me money and time," Clayton said. "Even if he loses the complaint, the legal fees and the delay serve him." "What are you going to do?" "Write to my attorney in Reno," Clayton said. "And then go to Carson City myself if necessary." "You should tell Miss Doyle," Hector said with a carefully neutral expression. Clayton looked at him. "Why?" "Because she has already heard about it from Pruitt's side," Hector said, "and because you have been going to town more often than you used to." The silence in the room had a particular quality to it. Clayton folded the document and set it on the table. "She is a practical woman," he said finally, which was not quite an acknowledgment of what Hector had said and was not quite a denial of it either. "She is," Hector agreed. "She is also the kind of woman who would want to know the truth of a thing rather than the version Pruitt tells." Clayton went to town the next day. He had told himself it was to send the telegraph to his attorney in Reno, which was true, but he also timed his arrival to coincide with the midday recess, which was not about the telegraph at all. Etta was outside with the children when he arrived, standing in the schoolyard watching Marcus and James Campbell race each other to the fence post and back, while several other children cheered with the cheerful non-alignment of the very young who had not yet learned to have preferences based on the color of a person's skin. She saw him coming and excused herself from the yard, walking to the fence. "I heard," she said when he was close enough. "I figured you had," he said. He took off his hat and held it. "I wanted you to hear my side of it." "I am listening," she said. He told her. He told her about the 1869 survey which had been conducted by a licensed surveyor out of Salt Lake City, properly recorded, properly filed. He told her about the decade since, during which he had run cattle and maintained the creek and built the barrage into what it was. He told her about Ingram's first 2 challenges, both dismissed. He told her about the new Carson City complaint and what he thought it was really about. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was a quality he had noticed in her, the ability to hold space for a thing while it was being said rather than organizing her response while he was still talking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You should have someone testify to your character," she said. "Not just the legal record, a character witness, someone whose standing in the community is clear and who is known to be fair-minded." "Who did you have in mind?" he asked. "I do not know yet," she said, "but I am thinking about it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You do not need to do that," he said. "I know I do not need to," she said. "I am considering whether I want to." The distinction seemed to land somewhere important in him, because something in his expression opened slightly, like a door ajar rather than bolted. "Why would you want to?" he asked. She looked at him with those complicated gray-green eyes and said something that was honest in the particular way she had of being honest, direct without being blunt, clear without being cold. "Because the way a community treats its fairest members is a measure of what kind of place it is," she said, "and I intend to live here for some time." It was not a declaration. It was not precisely a gesture toward him personally. But it was not those things either, and he felt it in the chest with a warmth he had not expected and did not know what to do with. He put his hat back on and thanked her and went to send his telegraph. He was thinking about the way she had said, "I intend to live here for some time," as if it were a statement about belonging that went deeper than the school year she had been hired for. And he did not examine the degree to which this pleased him, because examining feelings was not something he had cultivated any particular skill for. December in the Nevada Valley came in cold and fast, with a hard freeze in the second week that coated the morning ground with white and made the cattle restless. Clayton and his hands worked long days in the cold, and the bar H settled into its winter rhythm of maintenance and vigilance. The dispute with Ingram sat in the background like a stone in a boot, present and irritating, but he had sent his letters to Reno and received a reply from his attorney, a competent man named Sullivan, who told him the Carson City complaint was thin and would likely be dismissed on procedural grounds within 2 months. Clayton believed Sullivan's assessment and tried to let the matter rest in professional hands and return his attention to his ranch, which he largely succeeded at during the days when there was enough work to occupy every available corner of his mind. The evenings were another matter. He had begun to read his surveying manual again, which was an odd thing to do when the dispute was in Sullivan's hands, and he was aware on some level that he was reading it in the particular way that people reread things when they want to feel connected to a concern that is really a vehicle for thinking about something else entirely. He went to town twice in December on ranch business and saw Etta both times. The first time was brief, a nod and a few words in front of the general store. The second time was longer. He had finished at the feed store and was loading his wagon when she appeared beside him with a stack of papers under her arm and a new urgency in her expression. "Do you have a moment?" she asked. "I do," he said. She told him that she had been speaking with Reverend Aldous Cole, the minister of the Cracked Bell Church, who had been in the valley since 1871, and was, in her assessment, genuinely fair-minded and respected by most of the community. She told him that she had described the Ingram situation to Cole in general terms, without advocacy, and that Cole had said he remembered the original 1869 survey process because he had been present when the stakes were placed and had witnessed the surveyor's work as a casual observer. Cole had told her that everything had been done by the book. "He would be willing to make a written statement to that effect," Etta said, "if you think it would be useful to your attorney." Clayton set down the sack of grain he was holding and looked at her. The cold air had put color in her cheeks, and she was holding the papers against the December wind with both hands, and she was watching him with the expectant brightness of someone who has done a good thing and knows it. "You did this for me," he said. "I did this because it is right," she said. "You did this for me," he said again quietly, and it was not a contradiction of what she had said, it was something that existed alongside it. The color in her cheeks deepened slightly, though it may have been the wind. "Have Cole write to your attorney in Reno," she said. "His name and position will carry weight." "Etta," he said. She stilled at the sound of her given name from his mouth, which he had not used before. Something in the air between them changed pressure, the way weather changed just before something arrived. "Thank you," he said, genuinely. "You are welcome, Clayton," she said. She used his first name back. It was deliberate, they both knew it. He helped her carry her papers to the schoolhouse, and she made coffee again, and they sat in the schoolroom in the gathering December dusk with the wood stove ticking heat into the room, and talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with the land dispute. They talked about the children, which she had strong feelings about, particularly about the importance of teaching them to read maps and to think about the land they lived on as a system rather than just a backdrop. They talked about the valley, and he found himself describing it the way he almost never described it, not in terms of boundaries and water rights and grazing capacity, but in terms of how it looked in different lights at different times of year, how the eastern mountains went from brown to violet in the late afternoon, how the creek smelled in spring when the snowmelt was running. She listened to this with an attention that felt to him like being seen, which was a sensation he had very little experience with, and which affected him more than he would have predicted. She talked about Kansas, and about the school there, and about why she had left, and she was honest about the Gerald Pence situation in a way that was matter-of-fact rather than wounded, describing it as a mutual discovery of incompatibility rather than a failure. He listened without interrupting, which was easier for him than it would have been for many men because silence had always come naturally to him, and because He was finding that listening to Etta Doyle talk was a profoundly pleasant thing to do. When he stood to leave, the evening was fully dark and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees outside the schoolhouse walls. He stood at the door with his hat in his hand and looked at her in the lamplight and said, "I will be back on Friday if the weather holds." "I will be here," she said. He nodded and went out into the dark, and Etta stood in the doorway watching his tall shape walk toward the hitching post and untie carbine, and she thought, there it is. The thing she had been watching take shape for the past weeks, growing clearer like the mountains on a morning when the air was clean and still. He came back on Friday. The weather held. They fell into a rhythm that was unspoken and therefore all the more certain. He came to town on Fridays, and sometimes on Tuesdays, and the ostensible reason was always ranch business or the land office. But the actual reason was coffee in the schoolroom after the children went home, and the talking that happened over that coffee, which grew longer and deeper and more honest every time. He told her things he had not told anyone. He told her about coming to this valley in 1868 with $40 and a borrowed horse, and a conviction that had no rational basis that this particular piece of land was where he was supposed to be. He told her about the years of building the herd, the lean years and the losing years, the winter of 1872 when 20% of his cattle died in a blizzard, and he had stood in the snow looking at the losses and decided to stay anyway. He told her about his parents, both of whom were dead, his father from the war in 1864 and his mother from a fever in 1870, and about the particular loneliness of being the only remaining member of a family. She told him about her parents, her father a circuit lawyer who had died when she was 12, her mother who had remarried a decent but distant man and now lived in Ohio. She told him about the years of school teaching and what she loved about it, the specific pleasure of watching a child grasp a concept for the first time, the way a face changed when understanding arrived. She told him about the things she wanted that she had not yet had, not in a pitying way, but in the direct and clear voice she used when she was being most honest, saying that she wanted work that mattered and a place that was hers and people who were genuine. "Is this it?" he asked one evening in January. "This valley, is it what you wanted?" "I think it might be," she said. "I am still finding out." The January evening was cold, and the stove was running hot, and the lamplight lay warm and steady across the schoolroom, and they were sitting at two of the children's desks, which were too small for either of them, but which they used anyway because the alternative was standing awkwardly in the room's center. And Clayton was looking at her with the focused attention he had given her since that first morning at the stage. But there was something more in it now. Something that had accumulated over the weeks of conversation and coffee and honest talk. Something that had weight and shape. "I have not been in many social situations," he said, which was a thing that cost him something to say. She could tell by the slight stiffness with which he said it. "I know," she said. "I am not always easy company," he said. "You are very good company," she said. "You listen. Most people do not listen." He was quiet for a moment. "I listen to you more than I have listened to most things," he said. "I know that too," she said gently. The February complaint dismissal from the Carson City Land Office arrived in the third week of the month, exactly as Sullivan had predicted. The complaint was dismissed without hearing on procedural grounds. The surveyor's original documentation was found to be complete and properly executed. Reverend Cole's written statement had been formally entered into the record, and the territorial office found no basis for further review. Ingram received the notification at the same time Clayton did, and by all accounts his response was not gracious, but it was final. The water rights on Cutter Creek belonged to the Bar H, cleanly and completely, and without further question. Clayton rode into town the day the document arrived, and he went directly to the schoolhouse. It was early enough that the children were still inside, and he knocked on the door and Etta opened it and saw from his expression that the news was good before he said a word. She stepped outside and closed the door behind her, and he told her it was done, dismissed, finished. She listened to the summary of Sullivan's letter and then she smiled, and it was the full version of the smile he had only seen in pieces before, wide and unguarded and brilliant in the February light. "That is wonderful," she said. "I am very glad. I want to take you to dinner," he said. "This Sunday. The hotel has a dining room. I would like to take you to dinner there." She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back at her, and he had his hat in his hand as he always did when he was talking to her, and there was nothing careful about his expression. He was not pretending to be asking about anything other than what he was asking about. "I would like that," she said. The Caldera Flats Hotel had a dining room with 4 tables and a Mexican cook named Rosa who produced food that was considerably better than the hotel's general presentation suggested. On Sunday, Clayton arrived at the schoolhouse at the agreed time of 6 o'clock on Carbine, and he had changed into his good shirt and had pressed his trousers and had done something about his hair. And Etta came out of the back room in a dark green dress she had brought from Kansas that she had not yet had occasion to wear, with her hair arranged in a softer style than she used for the schoolroom, and he stopped on the doorstep and looked at her in a way that she would remember for the rest of her life. "You look," he said, and then he stopped, because the end of that sentence was too large for the ordinary language he had available. "Thank you," she said, as if he had finished it. He walked her to the hotel. Not on horseback, walked, with Carbine tied at the post and Clayton beside Etta on the boardwalk, and he offered his arm without awkwardness as if he were a man who had offered his arm many times, which he was not. But he was a man who, when he decided to do a thing, did it without hesitation, and Etta took his arm without hesitation of her own. The dining room had 2 other tables occupied that evening, and everyone who was there noted Clayton Haskins and the schoolteacher, because that was the nature of the place, but Clayton did not look at any of them. He looked at Etta. They had roast beef and potatoes and coffee, and they talked for 3 hours in the way that people talk when they have already established the deep channels of a conversation, and have only to let the current run. He told her about a piece of land on the north edge of the Bar-H, that he had been thinking about since he first saw it in 1870, a rise above the valley floor with a view of both mountain ranges and a spring-fed pond, where he had long had an idea of building a proper house rather than the functional structure he lived in now. She asked him about it with genuine interest, asking what the house would look like, what rooms it would have, and he described it in more detail than he realized he had stored, which surprised him. "You have been thinking about this for 8 years, she said. "I have," he said. "I just have not done it." "Why not?" He looked at the table for a moment. "Because a house is for people," he said, "and until recently I had not thought about whether I would be filling it with any." She met his eyes. There was no pretending the meaning of that was unclear. "Is that changing?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "it is." Outside the hotel after dinner, the February night was cold and brilliant with stars in the particular way of the high desert, where the sky went all the way down to the mountains on every side. They stood on the boardwalk and the cold was sharp and immediate. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have not been a man who was easy to know," he said. "I know that. I know what people in this valley say about me. I know I am not soft or easy or particularly comfortable to be around in many situations." "No," she agreed. "But I want you to know," he said, and he was looking at her with the full measure of what he was, the roughness and the honesty and the depth that she had been uncovering since October, "that I have not met anyone in my life who I have wanted to know the way I want to know you, and I am telling you this plainly because I do not know how to tell it any other way." She looked up at him in the starlight. The cold air moved between them and through them and around them. "I do not want you to tell it any other way," she said. "Plain is exactly right." She reached up and touched his face with one gloved hand, a brief and deliberate touch at the line of his jaw near the scar, and he was very still under her hand, and then he brought his own hand up and held hers there. "Etta," he said, and nothing else, but that was enough. He walked her back to the schoolhouse, and at the door he held her hand and they stood in the cold dark for a long moment, and he leaned down and kissed her, gently and carefully, the way a man kisses when he is aware that the thing he is doing is important and does not want to get it wrong. She kissed him back. She was not a woman who did anything without intention. The spring of 1879 came to Caldera Flats like every spring came to the Nevada Valley, with an abruptness that was almost violent, the cold breaking almost overnight into warmth and wind, and the sudden greening of the creek banks, the scrub oak coming out in new leaf, the range going from brown to a short-lived green that would fade to gold by July. The cattle were moved out onto the fresh grass and Clayton's hands worked the calving season, which was the most consuming time of the ranching year, full of long nights and exhausted days, and the particular satisfaction of a herd expanding as it was meant to. Clayton and Etta were, by the common understanding of the valley, courting. This was not discussed by them as a status, but was evident in every practical and visible way. He came to town more often. She rode out to the bar on Saturday afternoons when school was not in session. He met her in the evenings. They walked together along Cutter Creek when the weather allowed. The valley had opinions about this, as it had opinions about everything, but even the most skeptical of those opinions acknowledged that Clayton Haskins, who had never been known to spend time on anything without purpose, was spending his time on Etta Doyle with a commitment that was clearly not casual. Dolph Ingram, whose complaint had been dismissed and whose resentment had not, made a comment at the Copper Bell one evening in March about the schoolteacher and her evident interest in men with water rights, and the comment was relayed to Clayton by 3 separate people within 24 hours, each of them watching carefully to see what he would do. What he did was go to Ingram directly, at Ingram's own ranch, and have a quiet and apparently comprehensive conversation with him that no one else witnessed, and after which Ingram did not make any further comments of that kind. The valley found this both alarming and satisfying in roughly equal measure. Etta, when she learned about it, was not alarmed but was also not entirely comfortable. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him that if he had something to say about you he could say it to me," Clayton said. "I do not need you to fight my battles," she said, and her voice was firm. "I know that," he said. "This was my battle. He was insulting you to insult me, and I did not tell him to stop for your benefit. I told him to stop because it was the truth and I would not have it spoken falsely." She considered this carefully. "There is a distinction there," she said. "There is," he said. "All right," she said. "But next time tell me before you ride to someone's ranch." "I will," he said, and he meant it. Nathaniel Campbell came to Etta one April morning before school with a hat in his hands and a careful expression. The careful expression of a man who had learned through hard experience to be careful when asking for things in white spaces. He told her that his older boy, Marcus, who was 13, had shown an aptitude for mathematics and drawing that was beyond what the school curriculum offered, and he asked if there was any possibility of additional instruction. Etta told him that she would be happy to work with Marcus on additional material on Saturday mornings, at no charge, because talent was not something you allowed to go unattended for lack of resources. Nathaniel thanked her and then said, hesitantly, that he also wanted to say that what she had done at the beginning of the school year, coming to his farm herself, had mattered more than she might know, and that his family was grateful. Etta said that she was the one who was grateful, because Marcus and James had raised the entire level of the classroom, and she would have been poorer without them. She told Clayton about this conversation that Friday, and he listened to it with the full attention he gave everything she said, and at the end of it he said, quietly, "You are a remarkable woman." She looked at him. He said things like this rarely, and when he said them they had the solidity of things that had been considered at length and decided upon. "You are not a simple man," she said. "I want you to know that I know that. The valley thinks it knows what you are. I know something closer to the truth." He reached across the schoolroom table and took her hand. His hands had always been rough from the work, and she had come to find that roughness as natural and right as the rest of him. "I have been thinking about that house," he said. "The one on the north rise," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking about what it would need to be right for the people who lived in it." Her hand was warm in his, and the afternoon light was coming through the schoolroom windows at the angle that turned the dust motes golden, and the valley outside was full of spring. "What would it need?" she asked. "A kitchen with proper light," he said. "I know how to build that. Bookshelves. A room that could be a study." He paused. "A school nearby." She was very still. "Etta," he said, "I am not going to pretend I do not know what I am asking. I am asking you to consider whether a life at the Bar H is something you could want. I know the valley is different from what you knew. I know I am not easy, but I love you. I have loved you since about 3 weeks after you arrived in this valley, and I am not a man who uses that word carelessly." She looked at him for a long moment, and her gray-green eyes were warm, the warmest shade she had, the shade they went when she was feeling something large. "I know you are not," she said. "I would not ask you to leave teaching," he said. "The school needs you. The children need you. I would not ask you to give up anything that is yours." "I know that too," she said. "Then what do you say?" he asked. She brought her other hand over and put it on top of his, both of her hands holding his one rough hand, and she said, "I say yes, Clayton. I say yes to the house with bookshelves and proper kitchen light. I say yes to you." He let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, and then he smiled, and it was the full version, unguarded and real, the version she had been working toward since October, and it changed his whole face. They were married in June of 1879, in the cracked bell church on a morning when the sky was the deep clean blue of early summer, and the valley floor was gold green with the last of the spring grass. Reverend Cole performed the ceremony, and Hector Vega stood beside Clayton as his witness, and beside Etta stood Marian Alderman, the wife of Frank Alderman, who had become Etta's closest friend in the valley over the course of the school year, a woman with a sharp tongue and an honest heart who Etta trusted completely. The entire town came, which was not surprising. What was perhaps surprising was that Nathaniel Campbell and his family were there, sitting 3 rows from the front, and that no one said a word about it that Etta could hear, and that she chose to interpret this as progress rather than its opposite. Clayton and Hector had broken ground on the new house on the North Rise in late April, and by the wedding it was framed and roofed, the rooms taking shape in the way Clayton had described them that first afternoon he had spoken of it, with the kitchen on the east side for morning light, and the study wall already fitted with the beginning of its bookshelves. Etta had packed up the back room of the schoolhouse and moved what few possessions she had into the ranch house, while the new one was being finished, and living in the Bar H's functional main room with its sparse furnishings and its rifle on the wall and its 2 books on the shelf. She added her own books, a dozen of them, and her maps, and a small painting she had brought from Kansas that her father had commissioned of a river scene, and the room became something it had not been before. Clayton came in from a day of working cattle the first evening that her things were arranged in the room and stood in the doorway looking at the changes, and she watched him look, and his expression was a thing she would have been hard-pressed to describe. It was a man seeing a room that had always been functional and adequate become, without warning or deliberation, a home. "How does it look?" she asked. "It looks right," he said. After the wedding, after the celebration at the hotel dining room which Rosa exceeded herself for, after the guests had gone home and the cracked bell's flat note had faded from the summer air, Clayton and Etta drove out to the Bar H in the late evening in the wagon, and the valley was still and warm around them, and the stars were enormous, and she sat close beside him on the wagon seat with her shoulder against his arm. "Are you happy?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was considering his words with his full seriousness. "I have not spent much time thinking about happiness," he said. "I spent most of my life thinking about what needed to be done and doing it, and happiness was something that happened or did not happen around the edges of that. But sitting here tonight with you, I am aware that something is different from everything that came before it, and I believe that is what happiness is." She leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the stars and the dark mountains and the road ahead, and she thought that she agreed completely. The summer of 1879 was a working one. The new house on the North Rise took shape through July and August, with Clayton and 2 hired carpenters from the town working on it in the early mornings before the heat peaked, and Etta's school was on its summer recess, which meant her days had a different rhythm, one she was learning for the first time. She spent time at the ranch, learning its rhythms and its people. She had already known Hector well, and she knew now the other 3 hands. A young man named Percy who was 18 and from Tennessee and was the best rider of all of them. A steady middle-aged man named Amos who did not talk much but worked without complaint from first light to last. And a Paiute man named Tobias who had been with the Bar H for 3 years and whose knowledge of the land and the weather and the habits of the local wildlife was something that Clayton relied on more than he stated. Tobias and Etta had an interesting early encounter in which she asked him directly about the Paiute names for the local geographic features, because she wanted to add them to the valley map in her schoolroom, and Tobias looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not read, and then told her in careful English the names for the creek, the eastern pass, the northern rise where the new house was being built. She thanked him and he nodded, and that was the end of it. But after that, he answered her questions when she had them, and eventually, in small measured degrees, something that might have been friendliness developed between them. The valley's history with the Paiute people was not simple, and Etta knew it and did not pretend it wasn't. The reservation system had pushed the northern Paiute from lands they had held for generations, and the tensions this had created were present under the surface of daily life in ways that most of the valley's white population preferred not to examine. Etta examined them. She asked questions of Tobias when he was willing to answer, of Hector who had his own experience of being viewed as other in American spaces, of the Campbell family who understood displacement from a different angle. Clayton watched her do this and said nothing discouraging, which was its own kind of statement. The new house was finished in early September, 3 weeks before the start of the new school year. They moved into it on a Saturday morning that was bright and dry and cool, with the first suggestions of autumn in the air, a smell of sage and dry grass, and the particular spaciousness of the high desert in fall. The house was built of local stone on its lower half and timber on its upper, with a wide porch that faced the valley and the western mountains. And inside it had the kitchen with its eastern windows full of morning light, and the bookshelves in the study which were already half full of Etta's books and Clayton's surveying manual and his mother's Bible, and the account ledgers that were now neatly organized rather than piled on the table, and 2 bedrooms and a parlor and a wood stove in every room. Etta stood in the kitchen that first morning with the light coming in through the eastern windows and laid her hands flat on the work table and looked around the room and felt something settle in her that she realized had been in motion for a long time. "It is right," she said, which was the same thing Clayton had said about the Bar H main room when her things had been arranged in it, and he recognized it and smiled. "It is right," he agreed. The second school year began in October with 26 students, 4 more than the year before, as 2 new homesteading families had arrived in the valley over the summer. Marcus Campbell, now in his 2nd year of Saturday mathematics sessions with Etta, had advanced to algebra that she was teaching herself only slightly ahead of him, because algebra was not her strongest subject. But she was determined that his talent would not be limited by the limits of what she already knew, so she ordered the textbooks and learned them alongside him. Clayton came to the schoolhouse one Saturday to collect Etta for a ride, and found her and Marcus at the school table working through quadratic equations, with the focused intensity of 2 people equally engaged in a problem. He sat in the doorway and waited without interrupting, watching them. And he thought about the woman he had married, about what she gave to the world simply by being what she was, and the feeling it produced in him was something beyond happiness. It was something like pride and gratitude and love braided together into a single thing that he did not have a word for but felt with complete clarity. Marcus solved the equation correctly, and Etta's face did the thing it always did when a student got something right, the sudden illumination of genuine pleasure. "There it is," she said. "There it is, Marcus, do you see?" "I see it," Marcus said, staring at the page. "I actually see it." Clayton said from the doorway, "I will wait as long as it takes." They both looked up, and Marcus grinned with the comfortable ease of a child who had learned that he was welcome in spaces that had once excluded him. And Etta looked at Clayton with the warm shade of her eyes and said, 15 more minutes." "Take 20, he said. In the winter of 1879, Etta told Clayton she was expecting their first child. She told him one evening by the wood stove in the parlor of the new house, with the wind coming off the mountains and the valley outside the windows white with the first real snow of the season. She told him plainly, in the direct way she told things, watching his face as she said it. His face went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, and then something larger than surprise, and then something that was simply open, unguarded, without any of the controlled quality that was usually present in his expressions. He crossed the room in 2 steps, and she stood to meet him, and he held her with the careful strength of a man holding something he understood to be precious. "Are you well?" he asked. His voice was rough. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said, and held on. The pregnancy went forward without serious complication. Etta continued teaching through the winter and into the spring, growing in the practical and dignified way that she did everything, not pretending the discomforts were not real, but not allowing them to become the central fact of her existence. The valley watched with interest, and the ranch wives, particularly Marian Alderman, surrounded her with the practical solidarity of women who knew what this particular country demanded of a woman's body, and were determined that she would have what she needed. Clayton was, in the way of this particular man, utterly attentive without being suffocating. He rode the distance from the ranch to town every school day to see that she got home safely, and to bring the horse and buggy rather than asking her to walk. He learned to cook 3 things well, which was 3 more than he had known before, so that she could rest on the evenings when rest was what was needed. He sat with her on the porch of the new house on the spring evenings when the weather warmed, and held her hand and talked about the child and the future and the valley spread below them going green in the last of the sunset light. "What do you want?" he asked her one evening. "For this child," she thought about it. "I want them to be curious," she said. "I want them to be kind. I want them to know this valley the way you know it, and to know that there are 100 other valleys in the world that they could also love if they chose to go find them." "That is a good answer," he said. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want everything you just said," he said. "And I want them to know they are wanted, that they came into a life that was ready for them." She turned and looked at him, and the evening light was on his face, and the roughness of him was there, the jaw and the scar and the work-worn hands, and underneath it everything she had found over the months of knowing him, the depth and the honesty and the particular loyalty that he gave without declaration to the things and people he loved. "They will know that," she said. "I promise they will know that." Their son was born in August of 1880, on a Thursday morning when the summer heat was already full by 7 o'clock. He was a healthy and vocal child who announced himself into the world with the energy of someone who had been waiting impatiently for the opportunity. The midwife, a woman named Mrs. Harker who had delivered half the children in the valley, declared him perfect, and Clayton held him in the late morning light of the bedroom with an expression that he had never worn before, and that Etta, exhausted and entirely present, watched with all the attention she had. He was holding his son with both hands, carefully, the enormous rough hands that could wrestle cattle and work fence and lift grain sacks without effort held this small new person with a gentleness that was complete and instinctive, and his face was open in a way she had seen only a few times, the way it had been the night at the stage, the night on the boardwalk in February, their wedding morning, and now this. "He is remarkable," Clayton said. "He is," she agreed. "What do we call him?" Clayton asked. They had discussed names, but had arrived at no firm decision, agreeing that they would see who the child was before deciding. Etta looked at her son's face, which was red and furious and absolutely determined. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Robert Haskins. Thomas for no specific reason other than that it suited him, and Robert because it had been Clayton's father's name, and the choice of his father's name made Clayton's throat close briefly in a way that he did not apologize for. "Thomas Robert," he said. "Yes." Hector came to see the baby that afternoon, hat in hand and grinning with the warmth of a man who had waited a long time for the family of someone he considered his own family to grow. He held Thomas with a practiced ease that suggested that somewhere in his Sonora past there had been much experience with babies, and Thomas, who had been crying with conviction for the last hour, went calm. "He knows you," Etta said. "Smart child," Hector said. Marcus Campbell came with his father to leave a small parcel of food and a note of congratulation that Nathaniel had written in his careful schooled hand, and Etta read the note from her bed and felt the accumulated goodness of the year and the valley and the life she had made here with a fullness that made her eyes bright. "Thank you," she said to Nathaniel when he came to the doorway. "Your boy will have good teachers," Nathaniel said. And then, with the particular dignity of a man who had navigated injustice without being broken by it, he added, "We will make sure of it." Thomas Haskins grew. He was a substantial and cheerful baby who became a substantial and cheerful toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray-green eyes. And, as Hector observed when Thomas was about 18 months old, his mother's habit of listening before speaking, which was a quality that skipped most of the population in this valley. In the spring of 1881, Dolph Ingram sold his ranch and left the valley. He had been losing ground, financially and socially, for the 2 years since the dismissal of his complaint, and the departure was not mourned by anyone who spoke on the record. Clayton heard the news from the land clerk and said only, "Let him find his level somewhere else." And that was the end of the discussion. The school entered its 3rd year that fall with 30 students and a reputation that had traveled as far as the railroad junction at Hooper's Bend. 2 families had chosen to settle in Caldera Flats, specifically because of what they had heard about the quality of the school, and Etta was simultaneously flattered and overwhelmed by this, and responded to both feelings by ordering more textbooks and reorganizing the curriculum. Marcus Campbell completed his mathematics instruction with Etta in the fall of 1881 at a level that she told him honestly was beyond what she could take him further. She wrote a letter to the state normal school in Carson City and described his abilities and his situation, and asked what pathways might exist for a student of his background and circumstances. The response was not perfect because nothing in 1881 was perfect where a young black man's opportunities were concerned, but it was not nothing either, and Marcus took the letter and the information in it and looked at it for a long time and said, "I did not know that was possible." "It is possible," Etta said. "It is difficult and it is possible, and you have the ability." She told Clayton about it that evening and he said, "What does his father think?" "Nathaniel is proud and frightened in equal parts," she said, "which seems right to me." "What can we do?" Clayton asked. "We can write more letters," she said. "And we can make sure he knows that whatever he decides, the people in this valley who know him support him." "We can do that," Clayton said. In December of 1881, Etta told Clayton she was expecting again. This time he was not surprised, though he was equally glad, and he demonstrated this gladness by pulling her into him beside the wood stove and holding her there for a long time while the wind pushed at the stone walls of their house and Thomas made noise in the back room where he was supposed to be sleeping. "Two," Clayton said. "Two," she agreed. "Are you tired?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you happy?" "Yes," he said. "Both things are true." She laughed, and the sound of it in the warm house against the winter wind was one of the sounds that Clayton Haskins, the roughest rancher in the valley, the man who did not remove his hat for anyone, had come to understand was the truest measure he had of what a life was supposed to be. Their second child, a daughter, arrived in the summer of 1882 in the same room where Thomas had arrived 2 years before, with Mrs. Harker presiding and Clayton waiting in the parlor with Thomas on his knee, reading to the boy from a picture book that Etta had ordered from back east until the baby's first cry announced itself. They named her Clara, for Etta's mother whose middle name it was, and Clara Rose Haskins came into the world with her mother's coloring and her father's stubborn jaw, and an apparent determination to observe everything with total seriousness, which made Hector laugh every time he held her. Thomas, who was 2 and full of the sovereign confidence of the eldest child, regarded his sister with a mixture of curiosity and proprietorial concern that shifted, over the first weeks, into something clearly protective. By the time Clara was 6 weeks old, Thomas had stationed himself as her guardian in whatever room she was in, and would alert anyone within earshot if she was unsatisfied. Clayton watched his son with this small girl and felt something that he recognized as the rarest of things. A life that was exactly what it was supposed to be, exactly where it was supposed to be, containing exactly the people it was supposed to contain. The barrage continued to grow. By 1883, Clayton's herd was the largest in the valley. His water rights on Cutter Creek were legally unassailable, and the ranch employed 7 hands, including Percy, who had grown from a nervous Tennessee boy into a genuinely skilled cattleman and foreman material, and Tobias, who had been offered and accepted a formal foreman's position for the northern range, and whose knowledge of the land continued to be the most valuable intelligence the operation had. The relationship between Clayton and Tobias had deepened over the years into something that was neither friendship in the conventional sense nor merely professional, but something more useful and more honest than either. A mutual respect built on demonstrated competence and the accumulated evidence that neither man was going to waste the other's time with anything less than the truth. Clayton never forgot or pretended to forget the context of that relationship, the history of what had been done to the Paiute people and was still being done in the wider territory, and he made no claim to having solved or transcended any of it. He just tried to run a fair operation and to give credit where credit was due, and to listen to what Tobias told him about the land, because the land was the land and it did not care about the politics of who owned its water rights. It only cared about the weather and the seasons, and whether the cattle were moved before the grass was taken to roots. It was an imperfect arrangement in an imperfect world, and neither man pretended otherwise. Etta's school continued to be the center of something in the valley that she had not set out to build but had built anyway, which was a kind of community conversation about what the future of this place was going to look like. She taught geography and mathematics and reading and history, and she taught the history honestly, including the parts that were uncomfortable, including what had happened to the land before the ranchers and the settlers had arrived, including the story of the Paiute people who had lived in this valley for centuries before Caldera Flats had a name. This caused some parental complaint, which she handled with the direct courtesy that she applied to every difficulty. She invited the complaining parents to come see what she was actually teaching, and most of them, when they came and sat in the back of the room and watched their children engaged and learning, found that their complaint had less substance than they had thought. Not all of them. Some of them kept complaining, and Etta kept teaching, and the school board, which had by 1882 replaced Pruitt as chairman with Frank Alderman, who had found himself gradually persuaded by his wife's enthusiastic advocacy, supported her without qualification. Marcus Campbell went to Carson City in the fall of 1883, at the age of 18, carrying Etta's letters of recommendation and his own extraordinary mathematical mind, and his father's quiet pride and his mother's packed food in a saddlebag. And when he went, Etta and Clayton both stood on the platform at the rail junction at Hooper's Bend with his family and watched the train take him east. And Etta did not cry until the train was out of sight, and then she cried freely, which Clayton allowed without interruption, standing beside her with his arm around her until she was done. "He is going to do something important," she said. "He already has," Clayton said. "You saw to that." She leaned against him and he held her, and the platform at Hooper's Bend was empty now except for them and the Campbells, who were driving back to their farm, and the afternoon light was long and golden across the valley. "I want to do more," she said, "for the other children who have that kind of ability and not the path." "Tell me what you need," he said, "and I will help you get it." She told him over the following weeks and months about what she was thinking. A small scholarship fund for students of exceptional ability who needed material support to pursue education beyond what Caldera Flats could offer. Nothing elaborate, nothing beyond what a careful rancher and a frugal schoolteacher could manage between them, but real and documented and available. Clayton listened and said yes in the way he said yes to things he had already decided on, which was without hesitation and with the full weight of his intention behind it. The Haskins Education Fund was established in early 1884 with an initial endowment from the Bar H's operating accounts, and it was the only thing Clayton had ever put his name publicly on in the valley outside of his land filings. Etta administered it, as she administered everything with precision and fairness, and its first beneficiary was James Campbell, Marcus's younger brother, who showed a talent for mechanical drawing and engineering that was exactly the kind of talent that needed a path. The summer of 1884 was a hot one of the hottest the valley had seen in years, and the grass burned off early, and Clayton moved his cattle to the higher ranges in July, which required 3 weeks of intensive work from all of his hands and cost him sleep and weight, but saved the herd from the worst of the drought's damage. When it was done, and the cattle were in the right places, and the immediate crisis had been managed, he came home to the stone house on the north rise one evening, as the sun was going down, and sat on the porch where Etta was sitting with Clara on her lap reading to her from one of the picture books, and Thomas was chasing the dog across the yard below, and the valley in the last light was all the colors it got in the final hour of the day, gold and copper, and a deep rose at the horizon. He sat beside her, and she shifted Clara to make room without breaking stride in the story she was reading, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Clara looked up at him with her serious brown eyes that were currently the exact color of the horizon. "Papa," she said. "Good evening, Clara," he said. "Etta says the story has a dragon," Clara said. "Does it?" he said. "A kind dragon," Etta said, turning the page. "He keeps all the small creatures safe." Clayton looked at the page and the kind dragon, and then at his daughter, who was watching the picture with the focused seriousness that was already so much a part of who she was, and at his son careening across the yard below in pursuit of the dog, and at the valley spread before them in the evening light, the valley he had come to with $40 and a borrowed horse 16 years ago, and decided, on no rational basis at all, was where he was supposed to be. He had been right about the valley. He had been right about the house. He had been right, in the most important way a person can be right about a thing, about Etta. He tightened his arm around her, and she made a small sound of acknowledgement without looking up from Clara's book, and the evening settled around them, warm and complete, the kind of evening that does not ask for anything because it is already everything it needs to be. Thomas came back across the yard at a run, the dog bounding beside him, and called up to the porch with the full volume of a 4-year-old who has something very important to say. "Mama, Papa, the dog found a frog." "What did you do with the frog?" Etta called down. "Put it back," Thomas said, with the satisfaction of a child who has done the right thing and knows it. "Good boy," Etta said. Clayton called down, "Come up and wash your hands before supper." Thomas came up the porch steps at speed, the dog at his heels, and he climbed into Clayton's available arm with the complete physical confidence of a child who has never been given a reason to doubt that he was welcome there. And Clayton held both his children, Clara in his elbow and Thomas against his side, and Etta beside him, turning the last page of the dragon story. Hector came to Sunday dinner the following week, as he often did, and sat at the table in the big kitchen with the morning light coming through the eastern windows, and ate Rosa's recipe for beef stew that Etta had learned to make nearly as well as Rosa, and watched the family around him with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose personal history was such that family meant everything, and who had the great good fortune to have found one. "You are getting old," Thomas told Hector with the candor of the very young. "Thomas," Etta said. "He is not wrong," Hector said cheerfully. "I am 42 years old, which is very old." "Papa is 37, Thomas said with the authority of a child who has mastered numbers recently. "That is also old," Hector said. "Are you going to get married?" Thomas asked Hector. "So you have your own family." The table was quiet for a moment. Hector smiled, the comfortable smile of a man who had made peace with the particular shape of his life. "I already have my family," he said. "They are all sitting at this table." Etta reached across and covered Hector's hand with hers for a brief moment, and he looked at her with the fondness of a man who had known Clayton through the long solitary years before she came, and who understood fully what her arrival had meant. Clayton looked at Hector, and then at his wife and his children and the kitchen and the light through the eastern windows and the valley beyond, and he felt the full measure of everything that was here, the work and the land and the people, and the love that had built itself from a hat removed at a stage stop on an October morning into something that could hold 4 children at a Sunday table, and a foreman who was family, and a school full of children who were learning to see the world clearly and honestly. He thought about the woman beside him, who had arrived with a carpetbag and eyes like a summer storm, and had built herself into the center of this place not through any strategy or scheme, but simply by being herself, completely and without apology, practical and warm and honest and fierce about the things worth being fierce about. He thought about the morning he had taken his hat off before he knew his arm had moved, and about every moment since, and about what it meant that in a valley full of men who had never found a reason to remove their hats in the presence of a woman's voice, he had found it the most natural thing in the world. After dinner, when the children had gone down for their afternoon rest and Hector had ridden back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean, Etta stood at the eastern window looking out at the valley, which in September 1884 was going into its first autumn color, the scrub oak turning yellow and the creek cottonwoods going gold against the brown range. Clayton came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I am thinking about that first morning, when I stepped off the stage and you were standing in front of the copper bell." "I remember," he said. "You took off your hat," she said. "I did," he said. "I have never been able to fully explain why." "I have a theory," she said. "Tell me." She turned from the window and looked up at him in the afternoon light. "I think you are the kind of man who pays attention," she said. "And when you saw something worth paying attention to, you paid attention to it. It was not a decision, it was just you being what you are." He considered this. "That might be right," he said. "It is right," she said. "I have had 5 years to study it, I am confident." He took her face in his hands, the big rough hands that held things carefully when they mattered, and he tilted her chin up, and he said, "I love you, Etta Haskins." "I love you, Clayton Haskins," she said. "You are not always easy company. You are the best company I have ever had." He kissed her, in the kitchen with the eastern light and the golden valley, and the sound of their children sleeping in the back rooms, and the autumn coming in through the windows with the smell of sage and dry grass, and the particular clean cold at the edges of the afternoon air that said winter was months away but coming, and everything that needed to be built was built, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and there was only this. The ongoing and daily and extraordinary business of a life, shared between 2 people who had found each other across a stage stop in a Nevada valley in October of 1878, and had, in the years since, made something that neither of them could have. Made alone, the mountains were blue in the distance, the creek ran clear, the valley held the light. And in the schoolroom at the foot of the rise, the bookshelves were full, the maps were pinned to the walls, and Monday morning was coming with its 26 students and their 26 futures. And the woman who held the chalk was exactly where she needed to be. And the man who had taken off his hat for her was exactly where he needed to be. And the roughness of him and the clarity of her had made, between them, something that would stand as long as the stone house on the North Rise, which was built to last. And was lasting, and would continue to last through all the seasons of a life that had found its right shape, and would hold that shape with gratitude and with love for every ordinary and extraordinary day that the valley gave them.